Today on Safest Family on the Block, we're talking about travel health safety with Andrea Leschak of Wayfinder Advantage. Thank you for joining us today. If you like what you see, please do hit the subscribe button and the like button. It helps more than you know. If you love this, please tell a friend, find us on Facebook, or back our efforts on Patreon. Thank you again. Now let's get after it. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Safest Family on the Block, where knowledge is power. I'm your host, Jason, and with me today is Andrea Leschak. Hello, Andrea.
Hey, Jason. How's it going?
Fantastic. It's good to see your face again. I've known Andrea for several years. We've traveled together, and that's one of the reasons she's coming on today. Dr. Andrea Leschak is a board-certified pharmacist, a world traveler, and a travel health maven. She's the founder and CEO of Wayfinder Advantage, where it's her mission to empower every traveler, especially those requiring additional health support, to say yes to travel opportunities safely, with confidence, and with peace of mind. Download Dr. Andrea's complimentary ultimate travel health checklist to help you travel healthy and worry-free, and we will definitely include a URL where people can find that in the show notes.
Excellent.
So, Andrew, why don't we start? Tell us a little bit about how you went from being a normal mortal to somebody who can give advice about world travel from your own personal experience, both in the pharmacy industry and as a traveler.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was definitely one of those stories where you don't realize that your life's path is being laid out in front of you because you're too wrapped up in the emotions of it. I've been a pharmacist for almost 30 years, which I really struggle to believe that. And during that time, I've been traveling since I was a kid. I mean, my parents used to send me up to my grandparents. I was one of those original, the kids would fly unaccompanied. And I had my first trip over to Europe in the 80s. And I was traveling my whole life, but meanwhile, I had a very traditional course as a practicing pharmacist. When I was in my 30s, my mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And at that time, you know, she was a skilled traveler. She'd worked for the airlines, and she ended up surviving the initial diagnosis. And I was living overseas by that time, and she decided she wanted to come travel. And it was one of those situations where you just don't realize the chaos, the fear, the anxiety of traveling with somebody that has had such a heavy illness. And she had lifetime maximums of a lot of treatment. And so trying to keep her healthy, and well, there were all these moments of, who do we call if she gets sick, like she did one night? I don't speak the language well, so where's the nearest hospital? What would I do with her? And so when I came back to the U.S., I had continued traveling, and I really enjoyed it. And I was always thinking of doing something different with my degree, but I just hadn't found the kick yet that forced me over that edge. And last summer, when I had to move because my husband got transferred, I took a couple of days off, and my dad, well, actually it wasn't my dad, a hospital called and told me that my dad was sick and his life never went back to normal. He was diagnosed with cognitive impairment, and I knew I needed a different lifestyle. So I took some time off. I was traveling. I saw some really gnarly things happen down the Galapagos. I came back. I kind of laid all my cards on the table, and I was going, what can I do with everything that I've done? And somewhere the whole idea of putting all of the world traveling combined with the activities, diving, sailing, hiking, and being certified with geriatrics particularly, how do you help folks travel well, safely, with confidence and peace of mind? And that was Wayfinder Advantage.
Outstanding. And one of the things that I noticed, you're not just talking about a cruise or a trip to London, but you're talking about legitimate adventure travel. And both in terms of the activities like diving and rock climbing and the destinations where you're not just going, like I said, to London or to Boston, but getting to Southeast Asia, Central and South America in a way that is safe, both in terms of security aspects, which isn't your bailiwick, but is certainly one of the themes of this show, but also with the medical aspect, and that having a medical condition isn't necessarily a game changer, or what's the word I'm looking for here, a showstopper. There's a word. There's a word, and I'll find it eventually. At some point in this interview, I'll go, hey, and I'll say it. But anyway, this idea of planning for your health needs before you go. Could you talk a bit about why should travelers spend their time on that planning? There's so much to plan and so much expense, both in terms of money, in terms of energy, in terms of resources and time. Why should we give some of that to this aspect of travel planning?
Exactly. And it's one of those things where when I launched, I never knew a pandemic was coming, because a lot of people think, oh, you created this because of the pandemic. And it had absolutely nothing to do with that. Travel health and travel medicine as a more specific discipline, it's been around for a long time, but for many travelers, we just don't think about it. And to use a sailing term, I call it leaving the safe harbor of the known. The minute we start to travel, whether it be down the road, if I go to Florida or if I go overseas, instantly the dynamics are different. The variables are different, the factors. And so, like I mentioned earlier, being overseas, what is the equivalent of a 911? In the US, if I dial that, I have some assurance that somebody will show up. Now, the time that it takes, that can vary, but we know that that is a system that exists. We know that Walgreens is 24 hours or CVS is 24 hours, but do we know where the nearest one is? Would I know where my hospitals are? And so when you take that to the next level, take a person out of the country, and then by the way, like I was in the Galapagos, 20 hours by boat from the nearest, let's call it populated area, because we were diving out at Darwin and Wolf Island, you're really on your own. And so they did a briefing. They tell you, if you get swept out to sea, you've got your EPIRB, and this is what you do, or your personal locating beacon. It wasn't really an EPIRB. But, you're sitting there thinking about if somebody fell, like somebody did, and thank goodness it wasn't, too severe, but he had a knee joint replacement, you're like, ugh. But, if somebody falls or had a heart attack, how long does it take for an emergency evac to get there? Right? So, you start to do the math, and you start to realize just how on your own you are. And so travel health and wellness, it doesn't matter if you're within the US, just going to a new city or overseas, you need to at least spend some time considering the what would I do ifs.
For example, 911 is the universal emergency call in America, but not in Europe. You've got 199, you've got 999. It's different in every country. I always kind of figured that we should unify that. We can decide internationally that watermelon candy is not supposed to taste like watermelon, but tastes the same wherever you go. But we can't decide that it's 911 or 199. But starting with there, and as you said, the locations of the drugstores, the locations of the nearest hospital. When my family was living in Malaysia, the advice to us was if you had anything worse than a mild fracture, get your ass to Singapore or Bangkok, because there were no good hospitals in Malaysia. And that kind of information is really vital if you're going to be traveling, especially with children, especially if you get off, as I like to call it, off the reservation. Now, what are some of those things that we should be looking for while we're doing our planning? So really, I break it down into three broad categories. And then when I'm working with folks, we get very, very granular. So broadly, it is who you are, basically your baseline health and what you bring to the table, where you're going, and what you're going to do when you get there. So you and I, we did the Grand Canyon, right? We went rafting down the Grand Canyon. We had an amazing time. You and I both have peed and drank out of the same water, which I think is that really interesting experience, especially considering I'm a borderline germaphobe. So people still can't believe I did that trip. But, we were healthy and, fit and able to do the 7-mile hike out the Bright Angel Trail. So we brought to that table our age, which was, moderate at the time. I was in my 40s, you're a little younger. But, our skill set, we'd done some hiking. And so you're looking at your basic skill set, your knowledge, your comfort, your perception with that experience. So that's not just in terms of skill set for travel, but also your medical skill set and your security skill set. Navigation. Problem solving. There's some people who just could not they're just not
They can problem solve, they just don't use those skills very often. So terrain association, being able to look at weather, just simple, it's actually looking at all the skills that you have, because even when I work with somebody on a what would I do if, and they're like, well, I could never manage that. I'm like, well, actually, if you step back, we go through all kinds of challenges in day-to-day life. You have all the skills. You just aren't used to applying them to an unknown experience. So then you kind of fall back on A, B, and C. What gets you through your daily life, right? And then you apply that to the circumstances. Yeah, special training is always excellent, but we don't have it. So that's the who you are piece. The where you're going, political stability, is there a known outbreak? You know, do they have extremes in weather, temperature, whether it be, you know, like right now, you guys are having some unfortunate experience with fires. We have hurricanes on my side of the United States. And so being able to know that so that you can prepare in advance and have some kind of basic strategy. Do you understand how you would emergency evacuate or relocate quickly? And so that takes the destination and then your activities. Specific risks that you might be exposed to, whether they be extremes, elevation, water, you know, hiking, remote locations, and those pieces as well.
Okay. And as you said, when you do your thing, you have a whole checklist that you run with people piece by piece. And this reminds me a lot of in close protection and bodyguard circles, if you get a good enough company for a travel experience, whether that's international travel or just going to the next town over to do a speech or whatever, they do what's called advance work, where a professional researches your destination for security threats. And this feels like very much the same thing for health threats and health resources.
Exactly. And I do bring in situational awareness. Like you said, that is not my expertise per se, but having lived overseas, traveled a lot internationally, being a female, and I traveled independent while I was overseas, kind of how to activate that spider sense. I've taken some additional classes personally for me to be more aware, and then being able to share that knowledge. And if I know somebody, because there are websites, there are tools out there that a traveler can use, then I can have a referral to somebody if we need something more aggressive, you know, that's more dialed into a specific threat within that. But we do a little bit of a situational awareness piece as well.
Outstanding. And that is hugely important. We had an episode last season with Jim Alsop about some drills that you can practice today that you can teach your kids. And I do like this aspect of being able to plan this way, being able to plan for your children's health needs, and the fact that you'll have children's with you, this framework you've put onto it that lets you go to that place you didn't think you could take your kids. And you also mentioned that multi-generational travel is becoming more important, that I think a lot of the people watching this show, a lot of parents that I know, well, hello, there's a cat saying hi to us all. A lot of folks that I know, we're not only caring for and wanting to travel with our children, but we're caring for and wanting to travel with the people who we're the children of, our own parents. So could you address that multi-generational aspect of travel, health, safety?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you brought that up right after we're talking about situational awareness, because my husband, as you happen to know, your viewers wouldn't, is former military. He was an aviator for the Army. The only time I have ever seen him freaked out was when I was in Belgium with my mom, and he and I were traveling with my mom. We didn't know at the time she had brain cancer, so this was her cancer metastasized, but we were in Belgium, and he comes running up to me, and he looks at me, and he goes, "I've lost your mom." And I'm at a tea shop or something, looking at like a China set, and I was like, "How'd you lose mom? You know, what in the world?" He goes, "I told her to stand at a light post, that I was going to come looking for you. I looked over my shoulder, and I looked back, and she's gone." And in this moment, you know, you're sitting there trying to remember, what was my mom wearing this morning at 3 a.m. when we woke up and got dressed, you know, because she was wearing this big, you know, fluffy coat. You know, and you're going through this, oh my goodness, how far could she have made it, you know, in this town? Thank goodness she didn't wander too far. But, you know, people get lost. It happens. So how do you activate that the emergency system when you're trying to, find somebody in a foreign country. So there's that piece. Now, multi-generational travel in terms of safety, when I work with a group, and we did this just a couple of years ago, like I said, my dad was diagnosed with a cognitive impairment, and we were determined to have him still travel because my niece and nephew at the time were young teenagers, and I was adamant that they would not know him specifically as this older gentleman that sat in the corner and, still could talk about the Steeler game, but, really struggled with what did I have for breakfast, and he just sits there kind of quietly. And my dad, and I used to travel all the time. We did so many battlefield tours and all these different things when I was a kid. And so I was determined, how do we make this work? And so using the concept of it's a team, how do we make sure that the teenagers get out of it what they want and, your older adult? And it doesn't have to be somebody that has cognitive impairment or even a negative health experience or a disease state. But how do you look at win-win for the group? Now, since he does have cognitive impairment, we kind of turned it into a game with the younger people that at some point somebody always had eyes on Gigi, which is what we call him. And so, I didn't do every event. My sister didn't do every event. We made sure that there was an elevator in the place, and in the rental that we stayed at. And so you're looking for those key pieces that would allow us to be able to have a good experience with everybody engaged, to be like the team, as opposed to looking at it as labor or burdening just one person with it. And I know I'm talking a little too much there, but oftentimes the oldest female adult is the one who ends up carrying all of this because they're watching for the young ones and the older parents, and then they're just super stressed. And you end up in this, the fatigue factor kicks in, and it's not what it should be.
Absolutely. And there's a concept from Tom Pateri, who's a bodyguard out of New Jersey, who wrote a book. It's probably right here somewhere. Oh, yeah, it's right there. That he calls security blanket, which is in a two-person couple with kids. One person's role is security, and the other person's role is blanket. And blanket's job is the family.
Got it.
Keeping eyes on everybody, making sure they're all there, make sure everybody's safe and healthy. And then security's job is everything that's not the family. So you're watching for traffic, you're manning the map, you're checking the corners where there might be a problem. And then every once in a while, because changing your responsibilities is the closest to rest most parents get, you switch. And so, it's not being off duty, because parents are never really off duty, especially when you're traveling. But it alleviates that fatigue you're talking about simply by giving you a new set of problems.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you would sent me a great outline ahead of time, and you've hit all the points amazingly, even without being prompted. But let's talk a little bit about worst case scenarios, because one of the most important parts of preparing for travel or preparing for anything is knowing what can go wrong, so that you can find ways to counter that, alleviate it, stop it, and have a plan if it does go wrong. So what are some of the most reported causes of death and injury for international travel?
It's really interesting, because when I talk to people and they look at my lifestyle and they go, oh, you single-hand a sailboat, or you dive with sharks, they instantly think it's the sharks, and they think that, it's, sailing specifically. And what I like to remind people is, particularly with international travel, the top negative experiences that people have, depending on whether it's an injury, non-injury, an infection, it's kind of what we've always heard about. It's not sexy in a sense, but motor vehicle accidents, an injury is the number one cause of death, followed very closely by drowning when it comes to injury. And I don't know about where you were traveling, but when I sit here and think about some of the absolutely bizarre experiences I put myself into when it comes to motorized transportation, two people on a scooter carrying 80 pounds of dive gear, driving on the opposite side of the road. Never in the U.S. would I think of doing that. Yet didn't think a bit about that in Bermuda, because that's just what everybody was doing. But still, that is the leading cause of injury death. followed by drowning. The other thing, and as Americans, this is telling, and it talks a lot about making sure that you are fit to travel, as in does your travel meet what your fitness ability is that cardiovascular events or sudden heart attack is a non-injury leading cause of death. So just, and then that actually changes depending on the activities. So think of your exertion activities, skiing, hiking, diving, again, scuba diving. And so, because if you think about it, a lot of people, especially in the US with vacation policies, you may not do these events all the time. You're not diving all the time. You go maybe once or twice a year, and you forget how heavy that equipment is, dragging it in and out of the water. And then malaria is still, in terms of infections now, I don't know what's going on currently, it's going to be classified as, but not talking about that. But malaria is still one of the larger infectious disease concerns.
That makes sense. That's a very interesting point you brought up about whether or not you're in shape for what you do. Because a lot of people get what I call dad goggles, not to be sexist, but usually it's the dad who's doing something stupid. Where, well, I'm not going to get a chance to climb this mountain in Nepal again, so I'm just going to run on up that, even though the last athletic thing I did was chase my kid 20 yards when he told a particularly funny joke. And so that importance of not just taking a look at your medication needs, at injury needs, but of training up for it. I remember when we did the Grand Canyon, the Bright Angel Trail was just brutal. And we were, athletic, reasonably healthy people in our 40s. So, yep. But if any of those things had been true, that could have been a game stopper, a showstopper.
Absolutely. And that's why, again, when I'm working with folks, when I say, are we fit to travel? Does the travel experience fit where we are? I like to use Machu Picchu as an example. I haven't been there yet, but a lot of people talk about, I want to go climb Machu Picchu or hike the trail. And I like to remind folks, if you, like right now, if exercise is strolling 1 mile at sea level, give or take a little bit, and you've never been to altitude, if you've never carried anything up a mountain, I don't know if 4 days at altitude going up and down, it makes the most sense. Now, that doesn't mean you can't hike Machu Picchu. Do we have time to get you in shape for the experience, right? Can we modify the experience? Maybe you hire somebody to help carry your bags. I would have actually loved to have outsourced my bag up that up the Bright Angel Trail. And if we don't have the time, and if we can't do that other stuff, then maybe you just take the blasted train. You're still at the top. You still get to see it, but you just don't do the hike until we can get you to a point where you can do that.
So being honest with yourself about your physical abilities and sensible with making our decisions, which is very hard for a lot of parents, especially dads again. Excuse me. Because, we want to be 10 foot tall and bulletproof for our kids. And especially as those kids start becoming teenagers, and if you raise high school jocks and college jocks, and you're in your 40s trying to keep up with this 22-year-old college wrestler, which a lot of us do.
Yep.
And so baking those expectations into the plan to start with, I think, can be a way of overcoming that, so that the question doesn't come up in the middle of things when you're likely to let the smaller head do the thinking.
Exactly. Well, let me tell you, and to help take the focus off of the man in this particular scenario, I did it just a year and a half ago. One of my bucket list experiences was going to dive the Galapagos, right? I have wanted to dive the Galapagos since as long as I've known the Galapagos existed. Jason and I, my husband, we had looked at when the best opportunity at the time to go. We found out that there was a time where the water was the warmest and kind of the flattest. We would be exposed to as many currents, but we didn't book the trip. We hadn't booked it. At least I thought we hadn't booked it. So at Christmas time, I opened up a Christmas card, and guess where I'm going? The Galapagos. Oh my gosh, not to mention was I super psyched, but he'd already paid for it somehow. Now, side story, I was supposed to have sinus surgery because I've been having more and more issues equalizing my ears. There wasn't enough time to have the surgery before the diving to allow the healing process. So I thought, well, how bad could it be, right? I'll just dive. I've dove like this before. It won't be a big deal. So we get to the Galapagos. The first few dives, I was fine. no issue. I mean, yeah, I was having difficulty, but I could descend slowly. I wasn't pushing it. I felt good. We get out to Darwin and Wolf, where all the big, shark, hundreds of hammerhead sharks swimming in the water and schooling. The currents were kicking at a level that they had not seen at this time of year. The dive masters were completely overwhelmed. We're riding these ribs through these massive waves to go dive, and we get out to the dive site, and they're like, we need you to drop like Mission Impossible as quick as you can. You're going to wedge yourself on the barnacles, and I'm like, okay. I get in the water because I hadn't experienced it yet. I cannot descend. So I'm being blown down the reef further than everybody else. Well, underwater, blown down the reef. Finally descending, pushing through the pain and everything. Get down there completely overwhelmed because now I've got pain in my ears, the whole sinus issue going on. Finally had to call the dive after a few minutes. I was down there for maybe 15 minutes. I had no clue where Jason was. So we ascended. Thankfully, I didn't have any vertigo or any other problems, no permanent damage. But, I'm sitting there in my mind thinking, $10,000 on a trip, once in a lifetime. I got to do this freaking dive. I can't be the one sitting back on the boat. So when I get back to the boat, I start talking to other people, and they're telling all the stories. Somebody ran out of air. Somebody had this other problem. And I was like, you know what? Thankfully, something kicked in, and I was like, I'm 20 hours by boat away from land. This is not the place to have something really bad go on. And so I was the diver who had to sit out about 50% out at some of the best diving sites, some would argue, in the world. So it's not just you, and it's just not, we all, if we're avid travelers or we have that moment, we want to get it out, but that is not the time to do it.
And I feel like one of the best adages that I've ever heard is that you and me sitting at a table planning something are 10 times as smart as you and me in the middle of the thing. And so it seems like, to your point and to your business model, smart planning about not just what you're going to do, but what you're going to do when things go wrong. If you and Jason had sat down, for instance, and said, okay, guys, we saw the weather report. We're going to call it if the following things happen, whether or not we want to call it in the moment.
Exactly.
That kind of planning is exactly the kind of thing that allows us to go take our kids to dangerous places, or to go travel to somewhere that you're not quite comfortable taking your kids, but want to make sure you come home from.
Exactly, because it's about doing it again. Most of us, because in that moment where I was underwater, the thought that made me call the dive was that if one more thing goes wrong, I'm task saturated, and my husband's going to spend the rest of this trip trying to get my dead body back into the U.S., and that's going to be for him. And that's what made me call the dive. So when you're at that point, you're already too far into, the chaos.
So that makes real sense. So I want to thank you again for bringing us in today, and we'll put the link to Wayfinder Advantage in the show notes and to that guide, that checklist that you brought up, so that folks can see that and find you if they need to find you.
Absolutely.
But before we go, if there's one takeaway you want to make sure people bring from this conversation, what would that be?
Well, we've been somewhat talking about it for the last few minutes, but I just like to drive it back home. It's not judgment, and it's not a failure of anybody, but just be honest with what you're bringing to the table, because your medical conditions, your challenges, they don't go away miraculously because you're on a vacation, right? So if it's food allergies, if you're traveling with kids that have allergies, if it's fear, anxiety, perceptions about environments that don't feel quite right, that doesn't get better while you're traveling. It actually gets worse because, again, the variables and the factors, you're in unfamiliar territory. So be honest up front and make those adjustments on the front end. And then that way, again, you live to do the experience another time.
Well, that makes sense. And even beyond medical conditions, for example, in my family, I often travel with a 10-year-old, a 20-year-old who's in really good shape, my own self who's pushing 40 and who is not in as good shape as he thinks he is, and then my dad who's in his 60s who, unless physically stopped, will try to act like he's in the shape he was in his 20s. And so designing a travel plan for that group requires some work and effort, and that sounds like exactly the sort of thing that you're trying to tell us about, even without any kind of specific medical issue or condition to deal with.
Exactly. It's about honoring everybody's ability. It's not looking at somebody saying, oh, you're the weak link. Because there are no weak links. Everybody deserves to have a good experience while they're out there. And so how do you honor what everybody brings to the table? And then if you're in a group, then you find a way to allow each person to be able to experience whatever that activity is, and be able to enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your knowledge that you've gained over 30 years of schooling and traveling and things going right and things going wrong.
I'm 52 almost.
Well, happy soon-to-be birthday. And thank you all again. And thank you, everybody, for listening. As I said, we'll have information for how you can find Andrea in the show notes. And everybody stay safe. Thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching today. I hope you found something useful or at least entertaining. If you did love what you saw, there's a lot of ways that you can support us on Patreon, on Facebook, simply by liking or subscribing below, or by following the links you see right now to the other videos on our channel. Thank you again for everything you do to keep us moving.